You ever notice how sometimes we pray in these really desperate moments? You know, when we feel totally stuck and then, boom, God answers. And here's the thing, it's easy to just go, okay, great, crisis averted, and move on. But what if those moments are actually meant to pull us deeper, to change the way we walk with Him? Today, we're diving into that idea, looking at a story that shows how God's responses can shape not just the moment, but our entire faith journey. So, let's jump in. Alright, so let's set the stage a bit because, honestly, understanding the backdrop really makes the story come alive. Picture the land of Israel split into two kingdoms at this time. Up north, you've got the kingdom of Israel with its capital in Samaria, and down south, the kingdom of Judah, centered in Jerusalem. These aren't just lines on a map, they're two very different political worlds, with kings, advisors, armies, and, well, some serious tension simmering between them. The north, Israel, is led by King Ahab, a guy with a pretty notorious reputation. He's ambitious, often ruthless, and, easily influenced by his wife Jezebel, who herself brings some, let's say, rather questionable ideas into the mix, coming from a family steeped in idolatry. Together, they've got a reputation that precedes them, politically savvy, cunning, and sometimes, well, wicked in the eyes of God and the people around them. Down south, in Judah, we've got King Jehoshaphat. Unlike Ahab, he's generally seen as a good king. He's wise, prayerful, and much more cautious in his decisions. But here's the twist, even the good king sometimes has to navigate tricky alliances, especially with his northern neighbor who isn't exactly the most trustworthy. Historically, these two kingdoms had a fair share of tension. Sometimes it was verbal sparring, sometimes it flared into skirmishes, and other times they were just suspicious of each other's intentions. So you can imagine the scene, two kings, each with his own agenda, both aware of the other's strengths and weaknesses, and both walking a fine line between cooperation and conflict. And this tension sets us up perfectly for the events in 1 Kings 22. So what brings them together this time? Well, there's a common enemy, the king of Syria, Ben-Hadad. He's been causing trouble up north, capturing cities and threatening Israel's territory. Specifically, he's taken a city called Ramothgilead, which, crucially, belongs to the northern kingdom. Naturally, Ahab wants it back. He wants to reclaim this strategic city, and he knows he can't do it alone. So what does he do? He reaches out to Jehoshaphat. Now, imagine Jehoshaphat hearing this. He's generally cautious, right? But Ahab frames it as a joint venture against a mutual enemy. On the surface, it seems like a smart move politically. Two kingdoms teaming up, sharing resources, and potentially gaining victory over a powerful adversary. But beneath the surface, there's a lot more going on. Personalities clashing, moral compasses diverging, and frankly, God's larger plans weaving through all of it. Jehoshaphat, being wise, doesn't just rush in. Rush! He says, okay, we'll work together, but before we do anything, let's seek guidance. Let's find out what God wants before committing to a battle that could cost lives and shape history. Meanwhile, Ahab has his own set of advisors and prophets, many of whom are more interested in pleasing the king than speaking the truth. So, you've got this dynamic where the kings are physically aligned for a campaign, but spiritually and morally, the waters are murky. Add to that the geographical layer, Samaria up north, Jerusalem down south, the city of Ramoth-Gilead caught in between, and the Syrian forces pressing in, and suddenly, the stakes feel enormous. It's not just about two kings and one battle. It's about kingdoms, about faith, about trust, about listening to God or ignoring Him. And all of this sets the stage for a really compelling story. The political tension, the moral decisions, the alliances, and the looming threat from Syria make it clear that this isn't a simple fight. It's a test of leadership, of obedience, and of who truly aligns with God's plans. So, by the time we get into the actual events of the chapter, you can really feel the weight of the situation, the pressure on both kings, and the sense that every decision here is loaded with consequences that go far beyond just the battlefield. Alright, so here's where the story really starts to get tense. Ahab, the king of the northern kingdom, has his sights set on Ramoth-Gilead, a city that's been captured by Ben-Hadad, the king of Syria. This isn't just a random skirmish. This city is strategically important, and Ahab wants it back badly. So he turns to Jehoshaphat, the king of Judah in the south, and says, "Come with me. Let's go take this city together." Now, on the surface, that seems like a smart political move, right? Two kings teaming up against a common enemy sounds sensible. But here's the thing, Ahab's got a reputation. He's impulsive, ambitious, and often more interested in his own power and what looks good than what's wise or right. He's the kind of guy who'll leap first and ask questions later, especially when Jezebel, his notoriously manipulative wife, is in the picture. Jezebel's influence on Ahab can't be understated. She's ambitious herself, steeped in idolatry, and often pushes Ahab toward choices that are morally questionable. So while Ahab is eager and confident, there's a lot of danger lurking beneath the surface. Now Jehoshaphat, on the other hand, is a totally different character where he's cautious, prayerful, and he doesn't just make decisions based on appearances or immediate advantage. When Ahab asks him to fight, he doesn't just nod and follow along. Instead, he says something like, "Wait a minute, before we do anything, let's find out what the Lord wants." Right there, you can feel the tension building. On one side, you've got Ahab, impatient, ambitious, looking at what he wants in the moment. On the other, Jehoshaphat, wise and measured, insisting on divine guidance. The contrast is striking. And this isn't just a story about kings, it's a story that reflects human nature we still see today. How often do people rush into decisions fueled by ego or pressure, without stopping to really think or seek counsel? That's exactly what's about to unfold. So Ahab, though reluctant and probably a little annoyed, agrees to gather his prophets to get some advice. And here's where it gets a little crazy. He calls together about 400 prophets. Yes, 400. You'd think with that many voices, at least a few of them would be honest and say, maybe we should rethink this. But no, every single one of them is saying the same thing. Go ahead, fight. The Lord will deliver victory into your hands. No nuance, no hesitation, no real discernment. Just a chorus of yes men telling the king exactly what he wants to hear. And this is classic human behavior, right? How often do we surround ourselves with people who will agree with us, tell us what we want to hear, and avoid saying what we really need to hear? These prophets are doing exactly that. They're motivated by fear, flattery, or maybe even a bit of laziness. Either way, they're feeding Ahab's ambition and leading him down a dangerous path. But Jehoshaphat sees right through it. He's not fooled by this show of numbers or the unanimous agreement. He says, "Is there not a prophet of the Lord we can actually inquire of?" And that's when we get the first glimpse of Micaiah, the one prophet who doesn't just go along with the crowd. Ahab, predictably, doesn't like Micaiah. He even admits, "I hate this guy." Oh, not because Micaiah is evil, but because he refuses to tell Ahab what he wants to hear. He speaks truth, even when it's uncomfortable. And this moment, right here, captures the heart of the story. A wicked king chasing ambition and flattery versus a righteous, discerning king who insists on hearing the truth. You can almost feel the tension between them. Ahab is impatient, ready to charge, and surrounded by 400 voices telling him he's right. Jehoshaphat, calm and thoughtful, is like the steady anchor saying, "Hold on, we need God's guidance here." And it's not just about history, it's about human choices, about listening to truth instead of flattery, about the courage to seek real guidance even when everyone else is nodding in agreement. Imagine being in that room. You've got 400 prophets shouting the same thing, the king leaning forward, ready to act. And then there's Jehoshaphat, quietly insisting on God's counsel. The tension is palpable. Every person there knows that the decision isn't just about a battle, it's about life, death, and the moral direction of the kingdoms. This story shows us that wisdom often requires standing against the crowd, seeking guidance, and being willing to pause before action. And it also reminds us how dangerous it can be to surround ourselves with people who only echo our own desires. That moment in 1 Kings 22 isn't just a historical account, it's a vivid human story with stakes that are easy to feel. It's ambition versus caution, ego versus wisdom, flattery versus truth, and it's a reminder that the choices we make and the counsel we seek can have profound consequences. As we follow this story, keep that tension in mind because it's about to escalate, and the decisions made here will shape everything that comes next, not just for the kings, but for entire nations, okay? Now we get to Micaiah, and honestly, this guy is fascinating. He's the prophet who refuses to play the king's game. Unlike the 400 prophets who are basically just cheerleaders for Ahab, Micaiah isn't interested in flattering the king or telling him what he wants to hear. No, he's committed to speaking the truth, period. And that already sets the stage for tension, because Ahab is used to being told what he wants, not confronted with reality. So here's the scene. Ahab sitting on his throne, surrounded by his 400 prophets, all giving the same answer. Yes, go to battle, victory is yours. And then Micaiah steps up, and initially, he plays along. He tells Ahab what the others are saying, but here's the catch. He doesn't mean it. Some commentaries even suggest he's using a sort of sarcastic tone, almost like he's mocking the king's eagerness to hear what he wants. Imagine that. You've got the king all puffed up, thinking, finally, someone agrees with me. And Micaiah is standing there, barely holding back, ready to deliver the real message. And that real message, it's stark. Micaiah tells Ahab that he sees all Israel scattered on the mountains like sheep without a shepherd. And that's not just a poetic image, it's a prophecy that foresees Ahab's own death. He's the shepherd of his people. And here's the truth, the people are left without guidance because their king, Ahab, is about to die. You can feel the weight of that moment, right? It's not just words, it's a vision of disaster, a glimpse into the consequences of Ahab's choices, and it's delivered in the presence of the very king who doesn't want to hear it. But it gets even more intense. Micaiah doesn't stop there. He goes on to describe a vision of heaven itself. Picture it, God sitting on his throne, majestic and sovereign, surrounded by angelic beings. Some are on his right, some on his left, and there's a sense of order, hierarchy, and divine purpose. And God asks a question, who will persuade Ahab to go up and fall at Ramothgilead? The scene is almost cinematic, right? Angels, divine conversation, a king about to meet his fate. And then comes this shocking twist. A spirit steps forward, offering to be a lying spirit in the mouths of Ahab's prophets. God permits it. Now, pause for a second. That's wild, isn't it? It's a scene of heaven where even deception is, in a sense, part of God's plan. The lying spirit is allowed to influence Ahab's prophets, all 400 of them, so that Ahab is deceived. And the irony here is thick. The king, surrounded by prophets who all give him the same encouraging message, has no idea that it's actually a setup for his downfall. And Micaiah, of course, is the one who sees it clearly. He tells the truth while everyone else is unknowingly speaking lies. You can imagine the tension in the room. Ahab, probably growing impatient and irritated, can't comprehend why Micaiah is so stubborn. Micaiah, calmly, firmly, and with courage, refuses to bend. He knows that telling the truth might anger the king, might even put him in danger, but integrity matters more than flattery. And here's a thought, doesn't that reflect a reality we deal with today? How often do we face situations where telling the truth is uncomfortable, unpopular, or even risky? Micaiah stands as a perfect example of that kind of courage. He doesn't cower, he doesn't mince words, and he doesn't compromise. Now, let's visualize this for a second. You've got Ahab, a king who's all about appearances, power, and winning, expecting affirmation. And instead, he's confronted with this divine reality. Micaiah, the lone voice of truth, describes the people of Israel as scattered sheep and predicts Ahab's death. You can almost hear the gasp in the room. And it's not just abstract prophecy, it's a direct warning. It's a message that says, the path you're on leads to destruction. And the tension is electric because everyone present feels it, even if Ahab pretends he doesn't. The king, of course, tries to dismiss it, claiming it's evil prophecy. Classic reaction, right? He equates truth he doesn't like with something harmful. But Micaiah presses on. He describes the divine council, the angels, the lying spirit, and the reality that Ahab's false prophets are under this deception. It's sobering, and the human drama here is intense. You've got ambition versus wisdom, flattery versus truth, Fear versus courage. You've got a king blind to reality, prophets deceived by a spirit, and one courageous individual standing firm. And all of this is happening in a narrative that's both deeply spiritual and profoundly human. You can feel the stakes. This is about life, death, obedience, and the consequences of ignoring God's guidance. And Micaiah's prophecy is layered. On one level, it's about Israel and the battlefield, about a king who refuses to heed wisdom and divine instruction. On another level, it's about principles we live with today, the importance of integrity, the courage to speak truth, and the consequences of surrounding ourselves with yes men instead of truth tellers. It's dramatic, yes, but it's also very relatable. And the suspense, it's palpable. As Micaiah speaks, you can almost feel Ahab's growing frustration, the uneasy silence of the court, the subtle shifts of awareness among those listening. The weight of divine judgment is in the air, and everyone present knows something significant is unfolding. It's not just about a battle in Ramothgilead, it's about the clash between God's will and human ambition, and the tension of knowing that the king, who holds life and death over his people, is walking blindfolded toward his own destruction. While one man sees the truth clearly, it's gripping. Micaiah's courage and clarity set the stage for the dramatic events that follow in battle, but they also serve as a timeless lesson. Standing for truth, even when it's unpopular, even when it's dangerous, is critical. And here, we see the ultimate irony. Ahab is surrounded by 400 voices telling him what he wants to hear, but only the one voice of truth can actually guide him safely, and he ignores it. He chooses flattery and ambition over wisdom and warning. That tension, the dramatic irony of the situation, is what makes this story so alive. It's not just a historical account, it's a living, breathing lesson on human nature, divine oversight, and the consequences of our choices. So, as we follow Micaiah, we see more than prophecy. We see courage, integrity, and the high stakes of listening or not listening to God's truth. And that's what makes this scene so compelling. The interplay of human ambition, divine intervention, spiritual insight, and the weight of consequences is all here. And you can feel it in every word, every pause, and every reaction in that room. Okay, now we're stepping onto the battlefield at Ramothgilead. And honestly, this part of the story is tense, like edge of your seat kind of tense. So picture this. Ahab, the king of Israel, knows he's walking into danger. He's crafty, right? And here's the thing. He decides to disguise himself for the battle. He doesn't want to stand out, doesn't want the enemy to spot him easily, which, you know, sounds smart on one level, but we already know Ahab's character. He's more concerned with self-preservation than true courage. Meanwhile, Jehoshaphat, the king of Judah, is standing out in his royal robes. The contrast is dramatic. One king trying to hide, the other deliberately visible. And here's where the tension spikes. The Syrian army, under Ben-Hadad's command, has orders to target the king of Israel specifically. Their eyes are searching the field, looking for the figure they know represents the northern kingdom. So when they see Jehoshaphat in his prominent robes, they mistake him for Ahab. Can you imagine the chaos and fear in that moment? Soldiers ready to attack the figure in front of them, thinking they found their target. And here's the beautiful part. Jehoshaphat cries out to the Lord. Right there, in the thick of what could be total disaster, he turns to God in desperate prayer. And God answers. The Syrian army is diverted, the attack redirected away from Jehoshaphat. It's an almost cinematic moment, divine intervention in the heat of battle. You can picture the confusion, the noise of chariots, the shouts of soldiers, and yet, through it all, a subtle, unseen hand of protection guiding the outcome. But Ahab's fate isn't so fortunate. As he's fighting, a soldier from the Syrian ranks, completely unaware of who he's hitting, fires an arrow at random, and that arrow, it strikes Ahab right between the joints of his armor. Talk about dramatic irony. The king tries to be stealthy, to protect himself, and yet a random shot under God's sovereign direction finds its mark. And so Ahab, wounded and realizing the gravity of the situation, tells his chariot driver to turn him around and remove him from the fight. Even in that moment, he's trying to maintain some control over the chaos around him. The battle continues to rage. Soldiers clashing, chariots charging, but the king's life hangs by a thread. And here's the thing, there's a certain dark poetry in how this unfolds. Ahab spent his life pursuing power, ambition, and victories, often ignoring God, relying on deception and flattery. And yet in the end, God's sovereignty orchestrates the moment of his death. He dies propped up in his chariot, facing the enemy, almost like he's trying to maintain some final semblance of authority, encouraging his army even as his life slips away. It's dramatic, tragic, and yet strangely fitting given the narrative we've been following. Blood runs from his wound, the battle surges around him, and by evening, the shouts of retreat fill the air. Every man to his city, every man to his own country. Ahab dies on the battlefield, and his body is brought back to Samaria, where he is buried. There's even this grim fulfillment of prophecy, dogs lapping at his blood, as Elijah had foretold. And while that detail is striking, it's the bigger picture that hits hard. God's hand is at work in the events, guiding outcomes even when humans think they're in control. The irony is almost cinematic. Ahab relied on flattery, deception, and his own cunning, but it's God, unseen yet sovereign, orchestrating each twist, the mistaken identity, the divine protection of Jehoshaphat, the random arrow that fulfills prophecy. You can almost feel the tension in the air, the suspense as each moment unfolds, knowing that God's plan is moving forward, even as human ambition and folly play out around it. And the lesson is clear: human scheming, disguise, and manipulation can't outsmart God. Even in the chaos of battle, in the randomness that seems to govern life, God's sovereignty directs the outcome according to his purposes. The story doesn't just recount historical events, it paints a vivid picture of the intersection between human choice, divine judgment, and ultimate control. You can visualize it all: the smoke of the battlefield, the clashing of swords, the thunder of chariot wheels, Ahab in his stealthy guise, Jehoshaphat boldly exposed, the soldiers misidentifying their target, and the quiet, unseen presence of God weaving it all together. And the suspense, it's relentless. Every moment, listeners can feel the potential for disaster, the precariousness of human life, and the ultimate certainty of God's plans. This isn't just a story of war, it's a story of divine intervention, moral consequence, and the stark difference between Ahab's self-centered cunning and Jehoshaphat's faith-driven courage. The narrative makes you lean in, feel each moment, understand the stakes, and appreciate the depth of God's control even in apparent randomness. It's dramatic, vivid, and haunting, showing how human ambition and God's sovereignty collide in ways that are both terrifying and awe-inspiring. By the time the battle ends, the reality is undeniable. Ahab is dead, prophecy is fulfilled, Jehoshaphat is protected, and God's purposes remain unshaken. And for anyone listening, you can't help but reflect: how often do we trust in our own schemes or rely on appearances when God is orchestrating far more than we can see? The story is as much about divine strategy as it is about human folly, and it leaves a mark because the tension, the irony, and the vivid imagery stick with you. It's history and drama, morality and mystery, all rolled into one gripping narrative. So, after the chaos of Ramothgilead, we see something really powerful in Jehoshaphat. The battle is over, Ahab is dead, and the dust is settling. But Jehoshaphat doesn't just go back to his palace and call it a day. No, he takes a moment, probably more than a moment, to really reflect on what just happened. God protected him in the middle of a deadly battlefield. That kind of experience, you know, it leaves a mark on a person. And Jehoshaphat's response is fascinating because it's not just relief, it's a movement deeper into faith. He returns to Judah, to Jerusalem, and instead of just resuming business as usual, he starts actively leading his people back toward God. From Beersheba in the south to the mountains of Ephraim in the north, he goes among the people, encouraging them, reminding them of God's faithfulness, and inspiring them to return to the Lord. Imagine that, the king walking among his people, personally engaging them, motivating them towards spiritual revival. It's a vivid picture of leadership grounded in faith and gratitude. And here's the principle: when God answers prayers, especially in desperate times, it shouldn't just be a one-off moment of relief. It's not. Okay, crisis averted, now back to life as usual. Instead, it's meant to move us deeper. It's meant to strengthen our walk, to reshape how we live, to make our faith more tangible and active. Jehoshaphat understood that, The protection he experienced in battle wasn't just for his own safety. It was a reminder of God's power, a catalyst for revival, and an opportunity to lead his nation closer to the Lord. And think about the human element here. It's so easy for us to have moments where God intervenes in our lives, and our first instinct is just to breathe a sigh of relief and move on. But Jehoshaphat models something different. He lets the experience change him. He lets the answered prayer reshape his priorities. And that's relatable, right? How often do we experience breakthroughs, answers to prayers, or moments of unexpected protection, and then just go back to life the way it was? Jehoshaphat's response reminds us that those moments are meant to teach us something. They're meant to deepen our reliance on God and to inspire us to live differently. And it's interesting too because his actions have ripple effects. By personally engaging the people of Judah, he's not just growing in his own faith, he's cultivating a culture of faith and revival among the people. It's a domino effect. One person's encounter with God, especially a leader, can influence an entire community. And that's something we can apply in our own lives. When we recognize God's hand in our circumstances, it's an invitation to let that awareness shape how we live, how we treat others, and how we lead, even in small ways. The story also illustrates patience and reflection. Jehoshaphat didn't just react to the battle with emotional relief or impulsive action. He processed what had happened, understood the significance of God's intervention, and then took intentional steps to honor God with his leadership. There's a wisdom in that. It's the kind of response that turns a personal miracle into lasting transformation. And, it also highlights something about gratitude and focus. Jehoshaphat could have been consumed with the politics, the aftermath of the battle, or just the daily responsibilities of a king, but he prioritizes God and the people, showing that when we recognize God's work in our lives, our priorities often shift naturally toward faithfulness and service. And the principle applies beyond kings and battles. It applies to all of us. When we experience God's answers, it's a chance to pause, reflect, and ask, how does this shape me? How does this move me closer to God? How can I respond in a way that honors what God has done? It's about taking those moments seriously, letting them influence our choices and actions, and not treating them as temporary relief or simple luck. And there's an encouragement here too. Seeing Jehoshaphat's response, we're reminded that our walk with God is dynamic. It's not static. Experiences of God's faithfulness aren't just checkpoints. They're opportunities to grow, to engage, and to lead others by example. And it's human. We can all relate to that mix of relief, awe, and the desire to do better when we realize God has acted in our lives. Jehoshaphat doesn't just survive, he's transformed. He doesn't just protect himself, he inspires a nation. And that's exactly the point. Answered prayer isn't the end of a story, it's the beginning of a deeper journey, a call to walk closer with God, and an invitation to influence others positively with the lessons learned. So as we reflect on Jehoshaphat, we see a clear example of how to respond when God moves on our behalf. It's about awareness, reflection, gratitude, action, and leadership, all fueled by a deeper understanding of God's faithfulness. And it's a reminder to us that our own experiences of answered prayer aren't just personal victories, they're opportunities for growth, for deeper faith, and for meaningful influence on the people around us. That's the heart of the lesson here, and it's timeless. It's not just ancient history, it's a mirror for how we can live when we see God work in our lives. And it's an encouragement to let those moments propel us into a deeper, more active, more faithful walk with Him. Now, here's an interesting turn in Jehoshaphat's story, and it's a reminder that even when things seem under control, God can, and sometimes does, intervene in ways that completely redirect our plans. After the battle and the revival among the people, Jehoshaphat enters into an alliance with Ahab. On the surface, it seems like a smart political move. Two kings working together, pooling resources, maybe even thinking about trade and wealth. Part of this alliance involves sending ships to Ophir to bring back gold. Now, we don't know exactly where Ophir was, but the mission is clear. They're trying to gain riches and strengthen their kingdom. But here's the kicker. God steps in and the ships never sail. They're wrecked at Ezion-Geber, and suddenly what seemed like a clever plan is completely thwarted. Now, at first glance, this might feel frustrating. I mean, imagine putting all that planning into motion, thinking you've thought through every detail, and then bam, everything falls apart. And yet, that's precisely the point. God's sovereignty isn't about making us miserable. It's about guiding us toward what aligns with his purposes. This incident shows that even when we think we have it all figured out, there's a bigger picture at play. Our schemes, our clever solutions, our ambitions, they're not always in line with God's will, and that's okay because God sees the outcomes we cannot, and sometimes he gently or not so gently redirects us. There's also a human tendency here that's so relatable. We often try to control outcomes, right? We plan, we strategize, we think we're being careful and wise, and yet, if those plans aren't rooted in obedience to God, they can be entirely off course. It's like we're steering a boat toward our own destination, thinking we know the river's bends, when in reality, the river's currents are being directed by a much wiser hand. In Jehoshaphat's case, the failed ships serve as a subtle yet profound lesson. God has the right to wreck plans that don't align with his purposes, and he does it not out of punishment, but out of care and sovereignty. He's shaping history, guiding his people, and sometimes even teaching lessons about trust and obedience along the way. The wrecked ships are a vivid reminder that obedience matters more than cleverness or ambition. We can strategize, we can negotiate, we can build alliances, but if our path goes against God's purposes, he has the ultimate authority to intervene. And that's reassuring in a strange way, because while it might feel inconvenient or even frustrating at the moment, it's actually protection, a realignment toward what's truly best. This isn't just a historical note, it's a principle that applies to everyday life. How often do we get frustrated when things don't go as planned? We schedule our lives, we make decisions based on what seems logical or advantageous, and then life throws a curveball. And maybe, just maybe, that curveball is God's way of keeping us on track, steering us away from outcomes that could harm us or others, and nudging us toward a better, wiser path. And the story also shows that God doesn't need to make a big show of it. He doesn't necessarily call a meeting and explain the wrecked ships in advance. He simply allows events to unfold in a way that fulfills his plan. There's a subtlety and a sovereignty in how he operates. He's not micromanaging in a heavy-handed way, but he's ensuring that his purposes are accomplished, and that's where faith comes in. We might not understand why a plan falls apart, why a project fails, or why an opportunity we've been working for suddenly disappears. But if we trust that God is sovereign, we can rest in the fact that the outcome, even when it seems disappointing, is under his control and part of a larger, wise design. And there's another layer here about human nature. We often like to see results immediately. We like to feel the success, to see the tangible benefits of our cleverness or effort. But God's perspective is different. He's not concerned with our immediate gratification or recognition. He's concerned with alignment, with obedience, with cultivating hearts that seek him first, rather than rushing after their own gain. The wrecked ships remind us that God's timing and purposes supersede our plans, and that obedience and faithfulness carry far more weight than any immediate success. And here's a comforting thought. This isn't punishment for Jehoshaphat. He's a king who seeks God, who prays, who leads rightly in many ways. But even for a faithful person, God sometimes allows plans to fail if they're not perfectly aligned with his will. It's a lesson in humility, in trust, and in recognizing that our understanding is limited. So when we face setbacks, when our carefully laid plans crumble or our ambitions don't pan out, maybe it's not a failure. It might be a gentle, divine course correction. God is sovereign. He is steering the outcomes, even in ways we can't see. And that perspective transforms frustration into trust. It encourages us to stop trying to control everything and start seeking alignment with his purposes. So, reflecting on Jehoshaphat and the wrecked ships, we see a story that's surprisingly modern. It's about ambition, planning, human tendency to control, and divine sovereignty. It's about understanding that sometimes what looks like a failure is actually a course correction, a divine intervention that ensures our life moves according to God's greater plan. It's a reminder that obedience, alignment, and trust matter more than immediate results, and that God's hand is always at work, even when circumstances seem contrary. And the takeaway? when our plans go off course, when opportunities collapse, or when unexpected barriers arise, it's worth pausing and asking, am I in line with God's purposes? Am I trusting Him fully? Because, like with Jehoshaphat, God can redirect, protect, and guide us in ways far beyond our understanding. And when we let go of the illusion of control, we open ourselves to His sovereignty, to His timing, and to a deeper, wiser walk with Him. So to wrap things up, the story of Jehoshaphat and Ahab really shows us how God hears our desperate prayers and responds, often moving us into a deeper walk with Him. And sometimes, He even redirects our plans, so reminding us that His purposes are bigger than ours. It's kind of a call to pause, reflect, and trust Him more. If this story encouraged you even a little, maybe hit like and, well, consider subscribing so we can explore more of these stories together. Thanks for listening.